morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an interesting time, obviously, for Iran and also doing business in Iran. So I will basically try to go through some of the latest developments both in the field of politics, but also economy, and look forward to your comments and questions. You know that we had elections on the 26th of February. We had two elections, the elections to the Iranian parliament, or Majlis, and also to the so-called Assembly of Experts. I will come back to these two institutions in more detail. But if you want to capture the essence of these elections on Friday, last Friday, there is only one thing to say, and that's really the rejection of the hardline forces that have more or less dominated Iranian politics over the past 2 decades. I say 2 decades, many people sort of are surprised. They say, but we had the Khatami administration, which was a moderate administration, a reformist administration. That's true, but hardline forces were really dominant then as well. I mean, and I will show you some of the statements from there. But what is very significant this time is that some of the icons of this hardline thinking, for example, Mohammad Yazdi, who was actually the head of judiciary during the Khatami era, or Mr. Mesbah Yazdi, who was the mentor, the spiritual mentor of President Ahmadinejad, have all been voted out of these organs. This is very, very significant symbolically and also politically for Iran. So it looks as if the Iranian society has basically made a choice between a more hardline outlook, which was represented by people like Ahmadinejad, like Yazdi, Mesbah Yazdi, and I will mention some other figures, and the more moderate reformist outlook, which was represented by the former presidents Rafsanjani, Khatami, and the current president Rouhani. And it's obviously that the election results are an endorsement of President Rouhani's nuclear diplomacy and overall policies. In terms of economy, the Iranian economy has benefited basically in a psychological context and also in a financial context from the lifting of the sanctions. It's not valid to say that we can see the economic benefit, the real economic sort of turnaround in the country. That will, I think, take more time. But the psychological and financial impacts have created a new momentum, and now the election result will generate another momentum which could push the Iranian economy in a new direction. Even though the sanctions have been lifted, some of you know that a number of international organizations, especially international banks, first-tier banks, are quite hesitant to re-engage Iran. And that obviously creates a much slower process of re-engaging with the global economy than the government had hoped. So I will cover these important political but also economic events in the next few slides. Before I go any further, let me just briefly explain the Iranian power structure for those who are not familiar with this. We have basically three, if I can get this, we have three entities, these three entities that are elected by direct popular vote. So the president, the parliament, and the so-called Assembly of Experts. These two are elected for 4-year terms, and the Assembly of Experts is elected for an 8-year term. Now, about 2 years ago, a law was passed to hold the parliamentary and Assembly of Experts elections on the same day. This was actually a significant coup within the Iranian power structure, because as long as the Assembly of Experts elections were standalone elections, the voter participation there was very low. People would say it's a mullah versus another mullah, why should I care? But the fact that they were held on the same day, it actually pushed up the voter participation in the Assembly of Experts election as well. And that usually, we know that higher voter participation actually produces a higher support for the more moderate reformist forces. So this was important. So what happened was that on the 26th of February, the election results have actually changed the composition of these two important power centers. Another thing you can see in this structure is that there are quite a number of institutions, especially obviously the supreme leader, but all these different councils. Can you see this? Yeah. Councils on the left. These are all institutions that are mainly appointed by specific organs or individuals, especially the supreme leader himself. Well, the supreme leader is elected, could theoretically be dismissed, though it has never happened, by the Assembly of Experts. But the most significant function of the incoming Assembly of Experts will potentially be the election of a successor to Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader. The other institutions that are undemocratic are those whose members are either appointed by the supreme leader or basically are supervised by the supreme leader, all these councils. I'm saying that to state that now that we have a moderate president, a relatively or at least a more moderate parliament compared to the previous one, and also a more moderate Assembly of Experts, still doesn't mean that the hardliners are out of the power relations in Iran. They still exist. They assert their influence through the judiciary, through the security agencies, through other institutions. So still is a sort of a factional coexistence, but the factional balance has changed as a result of these elections. I mentioned a couple of the symbolic events, but the most significant symbolic event on the 26th of February was that all the 30 seats in Tehran, obviously Tehran is the most political constituency in Iran, all the 30 seats in Tehran were elected in the first round. We have never had this before. And all of them were from the reformist moderate list. Not one single conservative managed to get into the majlis from Tehran. The only person we can consider a conservative, Ali Motahari, was actually the number 2 on the reformist list. That's why he managed to get into the parliament. If he would have not been on that list, he would have also been out. This is a very important dynamic. Secondly, the fact that these figures, especially Mr. Yazdi, Mohammad Yazdi is the current chairman of the Assembly of Experts. He is the one who ran against Rafsanjani for the position of chairman of the current assembly and won, and was basically known as the main anti-Rafsanjani figure within the assembly. He is out. The second significant person, Mesbah Yazdi, both of them have the name Yazdi in their surname, but they are two different people. Mesbah Yazdi has been the spiritual mentor of the Ahmadinejad camp. He has been one of the most significant anti-Rafsanjani figures and someone very controversial also within the clerical establishment. He is also out. The most significant parliamentary member who is out is the former Speaker of Parliament, Mr. Haddad Adel, a relative of the Supreme Leader, and the number 1 on the conservative list in Tehran. If the number 1 on the conservative list doesn't get into the parliament, you can imagine how little support the conservative list had, at least in Tehran. To share a very funny anecdote with you, the Assembly of Experts elections actually run on provincial levels. So the candidates are provincial candidates. And we had one province, the Hormozgan province in the south, that only had one single vetted candidate. Because this is not allowed, they actually called some very young, no-name candidate from another province in Yazd. Just 3 days before the elections, they said, we have put your name on the ballot in Hormozgan, and you don't need to do anything, it's just formality. This guy didn't even travel to Hormozgan province. He sat at his home in Yazd, and the next day he was called and said, you have been elected as a member. This shows that the people were voting against the conservatives, against the hardliners. This guy in Hormozgan province was even Khamenei's representative, the Friday Prayer leader. all of the things you can imagine. He was the man of the establishment, and he was rejected. And we have a lot of similar stories. So the symbolism is clear. A rejection of those who are close to Khamenei, who are close to Ahmadinejad, and an endorsement of the Rafsanjani. One issue that is very important in Iran is voter participation. The level of voter participation makes the key difference in whether the reformists win an election or the conservatives. Essentially, the way you have to see it is that there is potentially a 25% segment of the Iranian society that's regime loyalists. They go and vote for the regime candidates, for those who are closer to the establishment. And that's why when voter participation is around 50 to 55%, the more conservative elements are more likely to win. The moment it goes above 60%, the more moderate forces are likely to win, because those who are mobilized to come beyond the regime loyalists usually vote for the other candidates. And this was the case here as well. If you see the last three elections, the last three parliamentary elections, where voter participation was between 50 and 55, those parliaments were controlled by the more conservative forces, and this time 62%, you can see the records were 1996 and 2000. In 1996, the moderates, the centrist forces around Rafsanjani won the parliament, and in 2000, the reformists swept the parliament. So you can see the relevance of voter turnout, and to give credit to the Rafsanjani and Rouhani camps, they actually managed to mobilize the voters. Tehran had a voter participation of 50%. This was a record. In Tehran, voter participation in any election, it had never gone beyond 40-45%. So 50% meant that a lot of people who hadn't voted before actually went to vote because they wanted to reject the more conservative hardline forces. So, in line with this voter mobilization, I can also tell you that almost every single political faction in Iran, even the ones whose representatives are actually in prison, decided to participate in these elections. That you could see that also in the number of initial candidates. About 12,000, more than 12,000 candidates signed up. More than half were initially rejected by the Guardian Council for different reasons, but mainly for political reasons. From that 12,000, about 3,000 were clearly reformist candidates, and 99% of those candidates were initially rejected, obviously for being affiliated with the former president, with the reformist forces, and so on. Some were then reinstated in the appeals process, but essentially more than 45% of the initial lists was rejected. Nevertheless, the moderates, the reformists, still managed to mobilize enough forces, some independent forces who joined them, and basically they managed to work within the massive restrictions and limitations that exist. Basically, the Guardian Council rejecting candidates and not allowing candidates to stand. The interesting thing is that when you look very closely at what happened, is that most of the hardliners, the more hardline elements within the outgoing Iranian parliament, who were clearly associated with President Ahmadinejad, especially the leading figures in Tehran, people like Mr. Resai, Mr. Baspash, Kuchak, so that all of them have been voted out. So as I said, clear signal that people are rejecting the Ahmadinejad thinking. So if we try to project the results, what we have now, 75% of the seats, we have 290 seats in the Iranian parliament, 75% have already been decided. So we can exactly say which factional orientation the candidates that have been elected do have. 25% will go into the second round, and we will have obviously the results after the second round, which will be in April. But if you project the second round and sort of try to estimate who will come out, this is roughly the composition we will get. So we will have about 35% moderates and reformists. These are people aligned with Rouhani and former presidents Khatami and Rafsanjani. Then we have 30% conservatives, hardliners, even though these are conservatives and hardliners, a number of them also new faces. I mean, these are new people who will emerge. And we have about 35% independents. And independents in Iran, you have to understand as local, provincial personalities who are mainly concerned about their local constituency. They are not in the parliament for political debates and political processes. They are there to lobby for more investment, more projects, more infrastructure in their own constituency. So you can imagine that these types of independents would be more aligned with the government, because that's the source of the government, is the main source of such investments. So I do believe that the more independent forces will align themselves with the government, even though it is quite possible that some of them will align themselves with the Revolutionary Guards. In some provinces, the Revolutionary Guards are quite powerful, and the Revolutionary Guards could also be a source of investments and infrastructure projects or job creation. So we should not underestimate the potential role of the Revolutionary Guards in attracting some of these independent forces. But it is, in my view, the majority of the independents will move closer to the government forces, especially because the leading figures in the new parliament, in the incoming parliament, are reformist and moderate, especially the ones who were elected in Tehran. We also have a new phenomenon in Iran which sort of indicates that some of the parliamentary deputies, some of the provincial deputies are aligning themselves with local companies, with the key sort of sources of, again, investment and job creation in their constituencies, which in most cases are apolitical. They are, and most large companies are also, again, affiliated with the government. So my prediction is that even though the moderates have not won a clear majority in the new parliament, the new parliament will be a more moderate, reformist behaving parliament in its relationship with the government, in its laws that it will pass, and so on. We will discuss what it means for the government. Let's have a closer look at the Assembly of Experts. When we look at the sort of clerics who have run and won the seats in the Assembly of Experts, here we have 88 seats. It's not as clear cut who is moderate, who is conservative, who is arch-conservative. You know some of the more famous figures, but there is a lot of sort of gray zone between the two factions, because most of these people are clerical figures, they're theological figures. But it's basically, the fact is, as I will show you, that the majority of the people who won seats are those who were on the lists produced by Rafsanjani. So you can see this sort of duality inside the assembly. On the one side, you have Rafsanjani, whose lists have won most of the seats. On the other side, you have figures like Yazdi and Mesbah Yazdi, who haven't even managed to get into the assembly. So again, here it's clear that it's a greater tendency towards the pro-Rafsanjani forces. Even though I said the most significant issue, the most significant process in the new assembly will be the election of the successor to the supreme leader, there will also be other debates that will emerge, especially a debate around the notion of whether the Assembly of Experts should actually supervise the supreme leader himself or supervise the institutions that are reporting to the supreme leader. Because this is one of the vacuums in the Iranian power structure, that there are a number of institutions that are solely accountable to the supreme leader, and because they are only accountable to the supreme leader, they do not feel responsible or accountable to anyone else. If the new assembly manages to introduce this debate and to insist that these organizations have to be audited and have to be supervised, it will change some of the dynamics in the Iranian power structure. Now, if we look at the outgoing assembly, as I said, there is a lot of gray area between the factions, but the last indication we can take was about 8 months ago when this assembly actually elected a new chairman. And back then it was Mr. Rafsanjani running against Mr. Mohammad Yazdi, who is not there anymore. Rafsanjani got only 30 votes. So we assume that in the outgoing assembly there were only 30 pro-Rafsanjani forces. In the new incoming assembly, 52 of the elected individuals were on the lists produced by Rafsanjani. This doesn't mean that all of them are absolute Rafsanjani supporters, but you can imagine that in a potential vote for the chairmanship or for other things, these 52 would be more aligned with Rafsanjani. And I think this is important, and we would have to, the first signpost is obviously, would Rafsanjani be the next chairman? The problem the other side has is that they don't really have any candidates right now, unless the former head of the judiciary, Mr. Shahrudi, decides to run against Rafsanjani. He has always avoided that scenario. He has never stood against Rafsanjani, but it could happen. So we have to see what happens when the new assembly emerges. So, what's the general political mood? I think I've said most of this. It's an endorsement of Rouhani and his mentor, former President Rafsanjani. There are various consequences. The short-term consequences, even though it's not very short-term, because the new parliament will actually come in, move in, or convene in July. So we are not talking about an immediate effect, but obviously the mood will move in that. Once the new parliament convenes in July, the government will have a much, much easier task in pushing through new agendas, laws, 5-year plans, etc., etc. So it will be a parliament that is more aligned with the government. In the medium term, the most important question will be who will be the successor to Supreme Leader Khamenei. And if my analysis is correct, and if Rafsanjani will have greater influence inside the assembly, you can imagine that there will be a push towards a more moderate figure. We can speculate about who those figures are if we have time in the question and answer session. Essentially, the events have consolidated Rouhani's power position, but as I said, this does not mean that the hardliners and conservatives have disappeared. They are there, and in the short term, in my view, there will be a backlash. They will try to hit back and undermine the government wherever they can. But essentially, if Rouhani is re-elected in June 2017, when we have the next presidential election, then you can imagine that there will be a new balance with a greater space, at least, for the more moderate reformist forces. What does it mean for the business climate in Iran? Even though we know political risk and all the related issues to business climate remain a risk in Iran. I mean, it's, again, just the election on its own is not going to change some of the legal and structural realities. But the fact is that with this type of a parliament, with a more moderate, more aligned parliament, the government can actually pass a number of laws and reforms that are needed to improve the business climate. And they do have actually a number of instruments. There is, for example, a law that is called the Law on the Continuous Improvement of the Business Climate, and it does not limit the scope to one specific law or field. It is designed to allow the government to improve the business climate in many areas. Rouhani himself has addressed the issue of corruption a number of times. It's not a secret anymore. I mean, it's all talked almost on a daily basis. And he has actually declared corruption a national security threat in Iran. And that means that there is a genuine push to fight corruption. And I think with this type of a parliament, with a more moderate alignment, there will be a lot of opportunities to improve business climate. We would obviously have to watch the actions in the new parliament beyond July. I'm now moving to the economy for the next few minutes to share some of the important developments. First of all, a quick snapshot. The two red indicators are the ones that are still very critical in Iran, even though the government has managed inflation very well compared to what we had in 2012, 2013. It is still a high inflation. It's a 15% inflation. And this inflation is not going to go much lower as long as the bank interests are as high as they are in Iran. Right now, we still have bank interests on deposits of about 20%. I mean, there is a push to reduce the level of interest rates, but it's a process, because if you do a drastic reduction, a lot of people will pull their savings out of the banks, and that will have other problems. And then obviously unemployment, even though the trend is positive, the level of about 10% general unemployment and about 22% youth unemployment are very critical issues, and that's why I always underline, that's why the expectation from the Iranian government, from foreign investors, is there has to be an element of job creation and local value addition. When we look at the movements of the Iranian GDP, these were the past few years. When Rouhani took office the last year of Ahmadinejad, we had a decline of about 6%. In Rouhani's first year in government, a decline of about 2%. Last Iranian year, we are just in the final days of the current Iranian year, so the year that finished in March 2015, a growth of about 2.5%, which was really a consequence of better economic management. You could see that there was a difference. Then we had, in the current Iranian year, the growth will be minimal, close to zero, and that's the impact of low oil prices. You can see better management had improved the situation, but low oil prices turned it around. And in the coming Iranian year, which starts on the 21st of March, a growth of about 4%, which is really a consequence of the lifting of sanctions. Iran can export more oil, export more gas, and obviously the overall cost of trade with Iran will be reduced because of the lifting of sanctions. But 4%, even though it's good, is not enough from the Iranian perspective. If you look at the unemployment figures, if you look at demography, in fact, Iran needs an 8% annual growth to really achieve its own goals. And that is obviously a major challenge. Interestingly, in the so-called sixth five-year plan, the new five-year plan that the Iranian government has presented, which will start theoretically, if it's passed, on the 21st of March, they talk about a 2.5% annual growth based on efficiency improvements. And this is a very important hint at what Iran expects from greater engagement with Western countries and Western companies. Efficiency improvements, and there is a lot of room. I mean, there is more than 10% room for growth through efficiency, because we have a lot of inefficiencies, energy inefficiencies, management inefficiencies, and so on. So the push is definitely there, but it will be difficult to achieve 8% soon. Exchange rates, you know that we have had two official rates in Iran. One, the so-called forex chamber rate, which is the official rate that importers and exporters use, but then also the so-called free market rate, also official, it's not illegal. The red line is used by the banks, the blue line is used by the foreign exchange bureaus. I included the figures from November 2014. Remember, this was the first time when people were expecting the announcement of the nuclear deal. You can see the reaction of the free market rate to the announcement of the deal in November 2014, and then to the announcement of a potential deal or a general agreement in March, April. But what is going to happen over the next few months, and the central bank governor has announced that the rates will be unified in July 2016. So it's really a question of a few months. And the big question is, where are they going to unify it? Are they going to try to push it down to the current level of the forex chamber rate, which is 31,000 to the dollar, or will it go more towards the free market rate? This is my prediction, and it's a bit people criticize me for saying that it's going to go up, but it will go up. And the reason it will go up is very simple. We could see that in the overall figures. One thing that has happened in Iran is that Iran actually has become more and more an export-led economy. Exports, non-oil exports, are important. Look at the trade surplus in Iran. Even in the current Iranian year, the left column, Iran has more than $20 billion of trade surplus. These are non-oil exporters. And the export community in Iran has no interest in an appreciation of the real. If you have a 15% inflation, and if your currency rates are, hard currency rates are going to change to your disadvantage, you are going to lose markets. So the push will be actually towards the higher free market rate, and my assumption is 38,000 riyals by mid-2016, which is higher than the current free market rate, but that's completely justified. If you were to actually calculate this based on inflation differential between Iran and the US, the rate would be somewhere above 40,000 riyals. And it's because the Americans have low inflation. But the reality is, economic realities are going to push the rate up. A quick look at the GDP composition, especially when we think about the impact of low oil prices and also where the opportunities are. I always say Iran has the most diverse OPEC economy in the world. And if you didn't believe me, these are the figures of the basically Iranian Statistical Center. Only 22% of the Iranian economy is actually oil and gas. We have a sizable agriculture sector, about 10%. We have a sizable manufacturing sector, but the biggest sector is services. And if you break down the services, you can see all the different professional services, transportation and communication, and government services obviously also important. So it's a very diverse economy, and as a result also less vulnerable to the oil price situation. Quick look at the Tehran Stock Exchange. Why I want to look at this is that this is one of the areas where we will see a lot of foreign investment activity. In fact, a lot of funds and investors are looking at the Tehran Stock Exchange. First of all, it is not a massive market capitalization. So we are looking at about $88 billion, even though a lot of the very large enterprises are in there, especially as you see chemicals, or actually petrochemicals, the largest sector. But also here you can see diversity. So if anyone wanted to look at investments in the Tehran Stock Exchange, there are a lot of opportunities. So with that in mind, what is the economic outlook? As I said, the lifting of sanctions have had a psychological and financial upside, financial boosts, but economic improvements will take longer. You saw the key structural problems we have with inflation, with unemployment, and so on. Add to this the slower than expected re-entry of international companies into the market. One of the best examples is the oil and gas sector. And here you see the problems. You see the Iranian government has already cancelled a number of conferences here actually in London to announce new oil and gas projects. They have announced the projects, but they still are working on the contractual framework. They are still trying to iron out the political disagreements around these projects that should be given to foreign companies. So you can see there are internal hiccups and internal bottlenecks, but there are also external bottlenecks. As I said, banks are hesitant to re-engage the Iranian market. They have to go through the due diligence processes. I talked to one of the leading private bankers in Iran. He said the world expects, in terms of compliance operations, the so-called Basel III compliance framework in banks. Iran is still on Basel I. So the Iranian banks have to improve their compliance structures, their management structures, and so on. So we are looking at a medium-term prospect in renormalizing some of these issues. At the same time, finding financial solutions is the biggest challenge in Iran right now. There is no shortage of projects. There is no shortage of foreign companies actually being interested in Iranian projects, but there is a shortage of finding the needed financial frameworks, and that is one of the critical issues. And obviously operational and legal risks remain. I'm sure we will hear about some of the legal issues. I mentioned unemployment and hence the significance of creating employment opportunities, and as a result, both as a result of the low oil price, but also as a result of the need for greater job creation activities, there will be also a greater focus on the private sector. In that sense, it's great to have a more moderate parliament who can then pass a few laws that will pave the way for private sector activity. And as I said, the emphasis of the government will be on creating joint ventures between Iranian and foreign companies. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through this. I did a couple of SWOT analysis. I think we sent this to everyone. Well, so you will have this. This is a detailed, when we think about opportunities, a detailed analysis of strengths and weaknesses, both in the field of economy, but also in the field of Iranian society. Iran has a very young urban society, but there are also a number of issues and weaknesses. Before I conclude, I want to answer, because this is the critical question, not that we have a moderate president, we have a moderate parliament, what is the outlook in Iran? And I wanted to sort of highlight those forces, those phenomena that enable a moderate, more liberal outlook, and the ones who would work against it. On the positive side, on the sort of enabling forces, we have obviously a more moderate parliament, and there will be a push to pass laws and regulations that are needed. The private sector will grow, and I think this is a very significant development. Also, the middle class will grow. We have had calculations of how the Iranian middle class will grow, even at the sort of medium level economic growth. It will be significant, and we know that the growth of the middle class has a positive impact on future election outcomes, on the overall outlook. And there will be greater interaction with the rest of the world, especially with the Western world, now that sanctions are lifted. But we have a lot of restraining forces on the other side. As I said, we still have arch conservative forces in Iran, the judiciary, the security forces. And they will create more and more restrictions. And especially now that they have lost these elections, there will be a pushback. There is a mafia structure, and don't forget the Chatham House rules. That around the network around the Revolutionary Guards here. This mafia structure is going to put pressure wherever it can. It can be through limiting the operation of companies, arresting people, putting pressure on the civil society, and so on. The society itself is depressed. Even though there is a lot of excitement, there is a social momentum, but a lot of the Iranian youth are relatively discontent. For example, it's very interesting. We have a phenomenon of the young couples in Iran who don't want to have children. In fact, it's become a major crisis, the trajectory of the Iranian population. We have millions of unmarried youth who are in marriage age for Iranian standards, and we have a lot of couples who don't want to have children. And the reason they don't want to have children is they say, we don't like to produce children in this society with all its limitations and issues. This society can actually, the trajectory of this society can create a lot of social problems, and obviously tensions with Western powers, especially if we have a US president, future US president, who then turn against Iran again. That trajectory can create new tensions, which then the hardliners will use to impose themselves on the situation. So let me close. What are the signposts? First of all, the biggest question is, will the government be able to push back against some of these arch-conservative hardliner agendas? Rouhani is someone who may not have the courage to do some of the changes that are needed because he wants to accommodate everyone. We have to see how the new parliament will act, if they will push back, but that will be important. And the first test will be actually the oil and gas sector. Will they be able to push through the new contractual framework? Will they be able to push through the fact that IOCs will have to start operating in Iran? They got privatization efforts. We know that in the Ahmadinejad years, the privatization efforts were mainly targeted at the semi-state institutions, especially the Revolutionary Guards. We will have to evaluate whether this government will try to look more towards promoting the real private sector. That will be an important sign. Some of the social and economic reforms, and especially the potential to limit the semi-state sector will be important. Khamenei himself, the supreme leader, will react to two big questions. One is there will be a major competition between two figures to be the next Majlis speaker. One is the sort of mainstream conservative guy, Mr. Ali Larijani, who was also humiliated because he ran from Qom, but he came second in Qom, which was unexpected, but sort of he knows that there are limits to his popularity. And then Mohammad Reza Aref, the leader of the reformists, who won, his list basically won all the 30 seats in Tehran. So this will be important, and Khamenei will basically have something to say about this competition. And then the question of how he will react to a potential push from the new assembly of experts to, for example, supervise the institutions reporting to him. This will be an important sign because it will show whether Khamenei actually got the message from these elections. Because the message from these elections were, we don't really like the people who are associated with you, Mr. Khamenei. Hence, the story in Hormozgan province is a clear message to Khamenei himself. Then the overall decisions on greater interaction with the rest of the world, especially continuation of maybe a better relationship, more improved relations with the European Union, with the US and so on. And finally, socio-economic trends and freedoms. Sorry I took a bit longer, but this is it. Okay. Good.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.